Close your eyes. Imagine a road. Not a modern road. An ancient Japanese road, packed earth, worn smooth by centuries of sandaled feet, running through rice paddies and cedar forests and mountain passes. The kind of road that in 17th century Japan connected the domains of rival lords, the towns of merchants and craftspeople, the temples and shrines that dotted the landscape like beads on a string. On this road, a figure is walking. He is not dressed like a lord or a merchant. He carries two swords, a long sword and a short sword in the style that marks him as a samurai. But his robes are travel-stained, his hair unkempt, his appearance deliberate in its carelessness. He has been on this road or roads like it for most of his adult life. His name is Miyamoto Musashi. He was born in 1584 in the final years of Japan's Sengoku period, the era of warring states, when the country was fragmented into dozens of competing domains and violence was the common currency of power. He died in 1645 in the early years of the Edo period, when the Tokugawa shogunate had imposed a peace so rigid and so thorough that the martial skills Musashi had spent his life perfecting were becoming increasingly ceremonial. In between those two dates, he fought over 60 duels. He never lost one. Not one in 60-odd duels fought across a lifetime, beginning when he was 13 years old, ending in his middle age when he retired from dueling entirely. Miyamoto Musashi was never defeated. He developed a style of swordsmanship that no one had used before. He became a painter, a sculptor, a calligrapher, a poet. He wrote a book, the Gorin no Sho, the Book of 5 Rings in a Cave, in the last months of his life that is still read today in boardrooms and dojos and universities across the world. He was not a simple man. He was not simply a warrior. He was one of the most complete human beings that Japan's extraordinary culture ever produced. And tonight we tell his story. So settle in, let the road stretch before you, let the mountains rise on either side, and let Musashi walk ahead of you into the dark. Chapter 1, The Child of Violence. Musashi's origins are, like so much of his life, wrapped in uncertainty and legend. He was born around 1584 in the Harima province of Japan, the western part of the main island of Honshu, in a region of mountains and rice paddies and small castle towns. His family name before he took the name Miyamoto was Shinmen, and he is sometimes referred to in historical records as Shinmen Taxo, the name he used as a young man. His father was Shinmen Munisai, a swordsman and martial artist of considerable reputation. Munisai was skilled in the use of the jut, a metal truncheon, and in swordsmanship, and had been granted recognition by the shogunate for his martial abilities. The relationship between Musashi and his father was, by the accounts that survive, deeply troubled. Some sources say Munisai threw the young Musashi across the room in a rage when the boy was a small child, and that Musashi barely avoided a thrown dagger. Whether this is literally true or legendary embellishment, it captures something about the violence that surrounded Musashi's earliest years. His mother died when he was very young. He was raised in part by his uncle, a Buddhist monk, which may account for the deep religious and philosophical sensibility that would eventually emerge alongside his warrior skills. Japan in the 1580s and 1590s was a country in the final convulsions of a century of civil war. The great warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi was in the process of unifying the country by force. Battles were fought, armies marched. The landscape of political power was shifting with dizzying speed. And in the mountains of Harima province, a boy named Taxo was growing up with a sword in his hands. He was already fighting his first duel at 13. The opponent was a warrior named Arima Kihei, a swordsman who had posted a public challenge in the area, inviting anyone to fight him. The challenge was the standard practice of musha shugyō, the warrior's pilgrimage, in which a swordsman traveled the country seeking duels to test and improve his skills. Takuzo responded to the challenge. He was 13 years old. Arima Kihei's reaction to finding a boy waiting to fight him is not recorded. What is recorded is the outcome. Musashi threw Arima to the ground and beat him to death with a wooden staff. At 13 years old, the boy who would become the greatest swordsman in Japanese history had begun his career. Chapter 2, The Warrior's Pilgrimage. At 16 years old, Musashi left home. He embarked on his personal musha shugyō, the traditional rite of passage for samurai in which the aspiring warrior traveled throughout Japan, fighting duels and learning more about his craft. It was not unusual for young samurai to undertake such journeys. What was unusual was how Musashi went about it and how long it lasted. For most aspiring warriors, the musha shugyō was a period of a few years, after which they would settle down, find a lord to serve and take their place in the feudal hierarchy. Musashi never settled. He spent most of his adult life on the road, serving no master, attached to no domain, beholden to no lord. He was a ronin. The word ronin means wave man, a samurai without a lord, drifting like a wave on the sea. In the rigid hierarchy of Japanese feudal society, to be a ronin was to be outside the system, respected for your martial ability, perhaps, but fundamentally rootless, without the social structure that defined everyone else's place in the world. Musashi chose this condition and maintained it for his entire life. He had reasons that went beyond mere restlessness. He believed, and this belief would become the core of his philosophy, that the only true teacher was experience, that a warrior who attached himself to a lord's household became comfortable, became complacent, stopped growing, that only a man who was constantly tested, who faced real opponents in real duels, who had to actually win or die, could develop the kind of skill that transcended technique and became something deeper. He called this deeper thing the way, the do, not swordsmanship as a collection of techniques to be memorized, but swordsmanship as a path, a way of living, of thinking, of perceiving the world that expressed itself through the sword but was not limited to it. If you know the way broadly, he would write decades later, you will see it in everything. He spent his teenage years and early 20s wandering the roads of Japan, fighting anyone who would fight him. He fought with swords. He fought with wooden bokken practice swords. He fought with a staff. He developed an unconventional habit of fighting with two swords simultaneously, the long katana in one hand and the shorter wakizashi in the other, at a time when almost every school of swordsmanship used only the long sword. He won again and again and again, against experienced warriors, against masters of established schools, against men with far more formal training and social standing than a wandering young ronin from Harima province. Word began to spread. There was a young swordsman on the roads, wild-looking, unkempt, unpredictable in his approach, and unbeatable. Chapter 3, The Battle of Sekigahara. In the autumn of 1600, Musashi was 16 years old, and the most important battle in Japanese history was fought. The Battle of Sekigahara. Japan had been unified under Toyotomi Hideyoshi, but Hideyoshi had died in 1598, leaving an infant son as his heir. The great lords who had served Hideyoshi immediately began maneuvering for power. By 1600, they had divided into two great coalitions, those who supported the Toyotomi heir and those who supported Tokugawa Ieyasu, the most powerful lord in eastern Japan. On October 21st, 1600, the two sides met at Sekigahara in central Japan. 160,000 men on one of the most consequential days in Japanese history. Musashi fought at Sekigahara. He fought on the losing side, the Western coalition that supported the Toyotomi heir, and survived the defeat that ended that cause permanently. The Tokugawa victory at Sekigahara was total. Ieyasu established the Tokugawa shogunate in 1603, and the political order it created would last for over 2.5 centuries, until the Meiji Restoration of 1868. For Musashi, fighting on the losing side at Sekigahara had consequences. He was never able to serve the Tokugawa government in any official capacity. The taint of having been on the wrong side at the decisive moment of the era clung to him throughout his life, reinforcing the ronin status he had in some ways chosen and in other ways had thrust upon him. But he survived. He walked off the Sekigahara battlefield, or perhaps fled it. The records are not specific, and returned to his road. The killing he had done at Sekigahara was not the careful, ritualized killing of the dueling tradition. It was warm, chaotic, impersonal, the violence of thousands of men in a killing ground. It may have affected him in ways that his later philosophy reflects. The emphasis on clarity and calm in the midst of chaos. The insistence that the warrior's goal was not merely to kill, but to transcend the need for killing through complete mastery of the self. He walked away from Sekigahara and went back to the road. And the duels continued. Chapter 4, the Yoshioka School. Kyoto, the imperial capital, the most culturally sophisticated city in Japan, the home of the emperor, of the great temples and shrines, of the schools of art and poetry and philosophy that defined what it meant to be civilized in 17th century Japan, and the home of the Yoshioka school of swordsmanship. The Yoshioka were the most prestigious swordsmanship school in the capital. They had served the Ashikaga shogunate as official sword instructors. They had trained generations of samurai. Their reputation was unimpeachable, or so it was until a young ronin from Harima province arrived in Kyoto looking for a test. Musashi challenged the head of the Yoshioka school. His name was Yoshioka Seijuro, and he accepted the challenge. They met at a pine grove outside the city. Musashi arrived late, a habit that he would maintain throughout his dueling career, for reasons that will become clear. Seijuro waited. The duel was brief. Musashi struck once, a single decisive blow, and Seijuro was down. The blow broke his arm. Seijuro survived but never fought again. The Yoshioka school sent its second, Seijuro's younger brother, Denshikiro, to avenge the family's honor. Musashi killed him. The Yoshioka school sent a third challenger, this time an ambush. Multiple warriors, some accounts say dozens, gathered to face Musashi at a prearranged location. The school was not going to lose a third time to a single wandering ronin. Musashi came alone to the ambush. He survived it. The Yoshioka school did not survive the damage to its reputation. The precise details of these encounters, particularly the third, have been embellished over the centuries. We cannot know exactly what happened, but what is certain is that the most prestigious swordsmanship school in the imperial capital was effectively destroyed as a credible institution by its encounters with Musashi. And Musashi walked out of Kyoto with a reputation that preceded him everywhere he went. He was 21 years old. Chapter 5, the greatest duel. In 1612, Musashi was 28 years old, and he was challenged by his greatest opponent, Sasaki Kojiro. Kojiro was everything that Musashi was not in terms of social presentation. He was polished, formally trained, the official sword instructor of one of the great lords of Western Japan. He had a style and a reputation that made him one of the most respected swordsmen in the country. His signature technique was called the swallow cut, a strike of such speed and precision, delivered with a sword so long that most men could not effectively wield it, that it was said to be essentially unstoppable. When Musashi was challenged to fight Kojiro on the small island of Ganryu, in the strait between the main island of Honshu and the island of Kyushu, it was understood by everyone involved that this was the most significant duel of Musashi's career. Musashi arrived late. Not a little late, significantly late. According to the most detailed accounts, he slept in on the morning of the duel, had to be woken, took his time preparing, and arrived at the island by boat hours after the agreed time. Kojiro was furious. He had been waiting on the beach in the summer heat, his composure fraying. According to tradition, Musashi arrived late, possibly to unsettle his opponent psychologically. Whether this was deliberate psychological warfare or simply Musashi's characteristic indifference to convention, the effect was the same. Kojiro's composure was already disturbed when Musashi stepped off the boat. Musashi had used the time on the boat to carve a wooden sword from the oar, a bokken. Against Kojiro's famous long sword, he was going to fight with a piece of carved wood. Kojiro drew his sword and threw the scabbard into the sea. Musashi looked at it. A man who throws away his scabbard, Musashi said, has decided he will not need it again. Whether he said this or not, the story is certainly embellished. The psychological implication was clear. Kojiro had committed himself totally to the duel. He had already decided that he would win and would not need the scabbard for a living sword. Musashi had not committed himself to anything except watching very carefully. The duel that followed was, by the accounts that survive, extraordinarily brief. Kojiro unleashed the swallow cut, the strike that had never failed him, the technique developed across a lifetime of practice. Musashi moved. His wooden sword struck Kojiro on the head. Kojiro fell. He died shortly afterward. Musashi walked back to the boat without looking back. The duel at Ganryu Island, the duel between Musashi and Kojiro, the carved bokken against the famous long sword, the late arrival and the thrown scabbard, became the most celebrated single combat in Japanese history. It has been told and retold, dramatized and embellished, painted and filmed for 4 centuries. It was the moment that Miyamoto Musashi became a legend in his own lifetime. He was 28 years old. He had been undefeated in duels for 15 years. Chapter 6, The Wandering Years. After Ganryu Island, Musashi continued to walk. The next 3 decades of his life are less well documented than the dueling years. The great stories had been told, or at least, the story of the greatest duel had been told. What remained was the slow, quiet deepening of the man who had survived all those encounters. He continued to fight occasionally. He took students for periods of time, young men who wanted to learn from the greatest living swordsman. But he never settled. He never established a permanent school. He never accepted a lord's service in any formal capacity. He studied. He studied painting and became genuinely accomplished. producing works that art historians still regard as significant examples of the Japanese ink painting tradition. His paintings of birds and flowers and figures have a quality that goes beyond mere technical proficiency. There is a quality of attention in them, a stillness, an awareness of the essential nature of the thing being depicted that reflects the same qualities he had cultivated in his martial practice. He studied sculpture. He carved figures in wood with the same decisive, economical technique that he applied to his sword work. No unnecessary cuts, no wasted motion, each stroke in service of the essential form. He studied calligraphy and poetry and the tea ceremony and the other arts that constituted the complete education of a cultivated Japanese person. He was working out in practice the core principle that would eventually become the center of the Book of Five Rings. If you know the way broadly, you will say it in everything. The discipline he had developed through swordsmanship was not limited to swordsmanship. It was a way of perceiving and acting in the world, a quality of presence and attention and economy of means that expressed itself equally in the swing of a sword and the stroke of a brush. He also, in these years, fought in several battles on behalf of various lords, not as a permanent retainer, but as a hired specialist, a man whose tactical intelligence and battlefield experience were worth paying for even without the formal commitment of service. He fought in the siege of Osaka Castle in 1615, the final campaign that extinguished the last Toyotomi resistance to Tokugawa rule. He fought with the Tokugawa forces this time. He survived as he always survived. And the road continued. Chapter 7, the philosophy takes shape. In the later years of his wandering, Musashi's thinking about the way of the sword crystallized into something that went far beyond fighting technique. He had spent decades fighting and winning. He had faced every kind of opponent, fast and slow, large and small, formally trained and self-taught. He had won with the long sword and the short sword and the wooden bokken and the staff. He had won in duels and in battles, in formal settings and in ambushes. And he had started to understand something that he had difficulty putting into words. The key to a warrior's success is strategy and discipline, not brute strength or innate talent. This was not a new observation. Sun Tzu had said something similar in The Art of War 2,000 years earlier. Every military tradition in history had understood at some level that cleverness mattered more than size, that preparation mattered more than ferocity. But Musashi meant something more specific and more radical. He meant that the warrior who was truly skilled had moved beyond technique altogether. A beginning student learns techniques. Intermediate students practice techniques until they become automatic. But the master, the truly advanced practitioner, moves beyond conscious technique to a state where the right action happens without deliberate thought, where the sword moves correctly not because the mind directed it, but because the mind has been trained so thoroughly that it no longer needs to direct it. He called this state the void, the fifth element after earth, water, fire, and wind, around which he would eventually structure the Book of Five Rings. The void was not emptiness. It was the state of mind in which all training had been so thoroughly absorbed that it no longer occupied conscious thought, leaving the mind free, clear, fully present, capable of responding to whatever actually happened rather than what was expected to happen. This is why Musashi could defeat opponents with superior technique. Their technique was conscious. They had learned specific responses to specific situations, and they executed those responses. Musashi's responses were below the level of conscious technique. He saw what was actually happening, not what his training told him should be happening, and responded to reality rather than to his training's model of reality. It is a distinction that sounds abstract until you consider what it means in practice. Kojiro had a technique, the swallow cut. He had practiced it thousands of times. When he saw Musashi, he saw the situation that called for the swallow cut, and he executed it. Musashi saw Kojiro and the sword and the moment, and moved. Not to counter the swallow cut specifically, but to be in the place where the swallow cut was not. The void is not a mystical concept. It is a description of what happens when a skill is so deeply practiced that it becomes instinct. Musashi spent 30 years learning this, and then he spent his last years trying to explain it. Chapter 8, the duel he did not fight. There is a story from Musashi's later years that tells you more about who he had become than any of the duels he won. A young swordsman, ambitious, skilled, already building a reputation, sent Musashi a formal challenge. He wanted to fight the greatest swordsman in Japan. He wanted to prove himself. Musashi did not respond. The young swordsman waited. He sent the challenge again. He waited again. Musashi still did not respond. Eventually, the young man found Musashi and demanded an explanation. Why would the greatest swordsman in Japan refuse to fight? Was he afraid? Had he lost his nerve in his old age? Musashi looked at him. He said roughly this: "I have already won this duel. I knew I would win it the moment you sent the challenge. What would be gained by fighting you? You would be injured or killed. I would have spent effort defeating someone who did not need to be defeated. There is nothing in this duel for either of us." The young swordsman was furious. This was cowardice dressed as wisdom. This was an old man hiding behind philosophy. Musashi let him be furious. Whether this story is historically accurate or a later invention, it captures something essential about the Musashi of the later years. The man who had spent decades winning every fight had gradually come to understand that the goal was not to win fights, but to be in a state where fighting was unnecessary. The sword is a tool. The way of the sword is a path. The path leads to a place where the sword is rarely needed, because the person who has truly mastered it radiates a quality of presence and capability that most opponents recognize and step aside from. The truest victory in Musashi's philosophy was the victory that happened before the swords were drawn. He stopped fighting duels sometime in his mid-30s or early 40s. He had been undefeated for over 2 decades. He simply stopped. He had nothing left to prove. And the road continued, but quieter now. Chapter 9, The Cave and the Book. In 1643, Miyamoto Musashi climbed into a mountain cave and began to write. He was 59 years old. He had been ill for some time, a condition that the records describe with a vagueness that suggests it was not fully understood even by those around him. He knew he was dying. He had been invited to serve the Hosokawa clan, one of the great lords of Western Japan, who had offered him the honor of formal employment for the first time in his life. He accepted, but he was too ill to do much active service. He was treated with extraordinary respect, given a generous stipend, provided with comfortable quarters, his presence considered an honor to the domain. And in 1643, he retreated to a cave called Raigando, the Spirit Rock Cave, near the city of Kumamoto. He wrote the Book of 5 Rings. He wrote it in the final 2 years of his life. The cave was dark and cold, and he was dying. He wrote by lamplight slowly, dictating some portions and writing others himself. The Gorin no Sho, 5 scrolls, each named for an element: earth, water, fire, wind, and void. The Earth Scroll establishes the foundation, the overall philosophy of the way of strategy. the importance of understanding the path broadly rather than narrowly, the necessity of constant practice across all areas of life. The Water Scroll deals with the individual combat techniques of the Niten Ichi-ryu school, the practical methods of the two-sword style. The Fire Scroll addresses the dynamics of battle, the psychology of confrontation, the importance of timing, the ways in which a skilled warrior can unsettle and confuse an opponent before the physical engagement begins. The Wind Scroll examines other schools of swordsmanship, their methods, their strengths, their limitations, always from the perspective of someone who has tested those methods in actual combat. And the Void Scroll, the shortest, the most difficult, the most profound, a description of the state of mind that is the ultimate goal of the warrior's path, clear, empty, present, responsive, not fighting from technique but from a deeper place that technique has prepared but cannot itself access. 2 years before his death, the famous samurai Miyamoto Musashi retired from dueling and retreated to a cave to write and reflect upon the true way of the warrior. He finished the Book of 5 Rings a few weeks before he died. He also wrote in those final months a short document called Dokkodo, The Way of Walking Alone, 21 Principles for Living Independently, without attachment to things or people or outcomes. Do not seek pleasure for its own sake. Do not, under any circumstances, depend on a partial feeling. Think lightly of yourself and deeply of the world. Never let yourself be saddened by a separation. Resentment and complaint are appropriate neither for oneself nor others. Do not interfere with the way of others. Be indifferent to where you live. These are not the principles of a man who had lived a comfortable or a conventional life. They are the principles of a man who had spent 60 years on the road, who had never belonged anywhere, who had found in that rootlessness not suffering but freedom. He dedicated the book to one of his students. He put down the brush. The book was done. Chapter 10, The Last Days and the Legacy. Miyamoto Musashi died on June 13, 1645. He was approximately 60 years old. He died in the cave, or perhaps in the house he had been given by the Hosokawa clan. The accounts differ slightly on this point, as they differ on so many points in Musashi's life. What the accounts agree on is that he died calmly, with the composure that his entire life had been spent cultivating. He had been in poor health for the last 2 years. The illness, possibly a form of cancer, had progressed slowly. He had known it was coming for some time. He had used the time well. In those final years, in addition to writing the Book of 5 Rings and the Dokkodo, he had continued to paint and sculpt. Works from this period are among his finest, a painting of a cormorant that art historians consider one of the great examples of the Japanese ink painting tradition, a carved wooden figure of Fudo-Myro, the Buddhist deity of immovable wisdom that still survives. He made his arrangements, he gave away his possessions, he had few, he said his goodbyes, he died without fuss. He was buried at Yuge in Mimasaka province, the region where he had been born. His grave is still there. He has not been forgotten. Miyamoto Musashi is widely regarded as one of the greatest swordsmen in Japanese history. His name is known not only in Japan but around the world. He has influenced films, novels, manga, video games, and even modern business strategy. The Book of 5 Rings, written in a cold cave by a dying man in the final weeks of his life, is translated into every major language in the world. It is read by martial artists and business strategists and philosophers and soldiers and athletes. Its insights about strategy, about the nature of mastery, about the relationship between practice and performance, have proven applicable to domains that Musashi could not have imagined. His style of swordsmanship, the Niten Ichi-ryu, the two heavens as one, is still practiced by a small number of dedicated students in Japan and around the world. His paintings hang in museums. His story has been told in films and television dramas and novels too numerous to count, most famously in Eiji Yoshikawa's sweeping historical novel Musashi, which was published in the 1930s and 1940s and remains one of the best-selling novels in Japanese history. He never married, he never had children, he served no lord for more than a short period, he accumulated no wealth, no estates, no social standing. He had the road, he had the sword, he had the slow deepening of understanding that came from 60 years of absolute commitment to a single path. And he had the book, which outlasted him by 4 centuries and counting. He had understood something that most people never fully grasp. That the discipline you bring to your craft, whatever your craft is not separable from the discipline you bring to your life. That the two are one. That the person who truly masters anything has not merely learned a skill but has transformed themselves. If you know the way broadly, you will say it in everything. He saw it in everything. Chapter 11, The 5 Rings. Before we rest, it is worth spending a moment with the book itself. The Book of 5 Rings is not a long book. It can be read in an afternoon, but it rewards returning to. Each reading reveals things that earlier readings missed, in the way of all genuinely profound texts. Its structure mirrors Musashi's understanding of reality, moving from the concrete and practical to the abstract and philosophical. The Earth Ring establishes the ground. Musashi begins by describing the way of strategy, not swordsmanship as a technical skill, but as a complete approach to life. He emphasizes the importance of knowing many things, of not specializing so narrowly that you lose the broader view, of understanding your own path in relation to the world around you. The Water Ring is about fluidity. The swordsman's mind should be like water, taking the shape of whatever contains it, moving without hesitation, finding the path of least resistance to its objective. This is perhaps the most famous element of Musashi's philosophy, the instruction to adapt, to respond to what is actually happening rather than to what you expected or planned for. The Fire Ring is about combat itself, not merely physical combat, but the combat of any high-stakes situation, the importance of initiative, the power of timing, the way in which a skilled strategist creates the conditions for victory before the decisive moment arrives. The Wind Ring examines how other schools and approaches differ from Musashi's. It is a comparative analysis, generous in acknowledging others' strengths but clear about what Musashi believed they missed, primarily the tendency to become too specialized, too technical, too focused on particular movements at the expense of the broader understanding. And the void. The void is emptiness that is not emptiness. It is the absence of confusion, the clarity that comes when all the training is done and there is nothing between the warrior and the moment. No hesitation, no calculation, no fear, just the plain, present engagement with what is actually happening. Musashi writes of the void, there is nothing, there is everything. He knew this was difficult to explain. He had spent 60 years finding it, and he was not sure the words could transmit it. But he tried. The Book of 5 Rings is the record of that attempt. A dying man in a cold cave, writing down everything he had learned across a lifetime of extraordinary experience, in the hope that some of it would be useful to whoever came after. It was useful. It still is. Closing, the road continues. And so the story of Miyamoto Musashi comes to rest. 60 years, from the boy in the mountains of Harima who killed his first opponent at 13, to the old man in the cave of Rigando writing down what he had learned in the last light of his life. More than 60 duels, not one defeat. A life on the road that most people would have found lonely beyond endurance, and that Musashi found necessary, the only way to keep growing, to keep being tested, to keep moving toward the understanding he was seeking. A sword that became a brush, that became a philosophy, that became a book, that is still read 4 centuries later. He was not a comfortable man to be around. The accounts we have suggest someone who was intense, unconventional, indifferent to social niceties, deeply self-contained. He did not go out of his way to make people like him. He did not dress well or comport himself in the elegant manner that Japanese aristocratic culture valued. He was too busy walking. But he understood something profound about how a human life can be lived, about the relationship between discipline and freedom, between practice and mastery, between the particular skill and the broader way. He understood that the sword was not the point. The way was the point. And the way, if followed faithfully, led somewhere that the sword was no longer needed. Let those images settle now, like ink drying on paper. The boy beating Arima Kihei with a wooden staff. The young man arriving late at the island of Ganryu, carving his bokken from an oar on the boat. The painter in his old age, a cormorant emerging from his brush with the economy of a perfect sword stroke. The old man in the cave, writing by lamplight, the wind at the entrance, the mountain around him. Let the names grow quiet. Musashi Kojiro, the Yoshioka School, the Book of 5 Rings. The road is dark and quiet. There are no more duels tonight. No more challenges to answer, no more techniques to master, no more pages to write. Only the mountain and the cave and the lamp burning low and the long quiet dark. And sleep, a soft, deep, dreamless sleep. Good night.